Ranald from the Fair Trade Network, and I've been interested in the European Union historically as a progressive, an attempt to have more than a trade agreement, a progressive political formation which was meant to, in its original concept, have ideals which included human rights and environmental sustainability and so on. And I've really got two questions. One is, I think it would be helpful if you said a little bit more about the politics of Podemos and how it compares with groups like Syriza in Greece in terms of its anti-neoliberal thrust and a reaction to the, particularly the austerity programs of post-financial crisis, and how that has attracted and mobilised young people, what sort of things they've done to do that. And the second question is, given the rise of the radical right and neo-fascist movements which you described, do you think that there is still room for this progressive vision, transnational vision of the European project, which could both project common human rights and environmental sustainability values but accommodate regional aspirations such as in the various regions you've talked about in Spain?
Thanks very much, Pat, for those questions. And let me see if I can as well answer them in short. To summarize what the politics of Podemos are about, we could recover certain concept of social democracy before it became an empty word. As a matter of fact, and for you to know what Podemos is about at the moment, before the last election in June, the leader of Podemos, Pablo Iglesias, released a sort of manifesto or a document describing what, in his view, Podemos was going to represent within the near future, which is the potential of a fourth social democratic moment or a fourth social democracy. Let's just briefly come back to history and recall that the first social democracy was emerging within the realm of Marxism and really workers' movements in the late 19th century. There was a second social democracy that even after the turmoil of the divisions around the First World War and then the Soviet Revolution, materialized in the post-Second World War welfare state, a notion of really politics in which the safety networks were very strong for the whole citizenry, and in which the intervention of the state, in the one hand, in the realm of economy, was considered to be as acceptable when necessary, but on the other hand, there was an understanding of social services as responding to human rights that needed to be observed. That's a second period of social democracy that basically ran up until a third stage in which social democracy with the emerging movements of proto-neoliberal governance led by Margaret Thatcher, among others, basically gave room to merging between social democracy and conventional business as usual neoliberalism. That certainly has weakened the left-leaning parties or those which had the banners of left-leaning parties in Europe, and left a vacuum in which no alternative was presented to what we may denominate the extreme center. Extreme center characterized by neoliberal policies run by right-wing or social democratic parties. At the moment, therefore, the proposal would be to recover a fourth social democracy in which the priorities would be largely associated with the recovery of a strong welfare state, understood as a state in which, on the one hand, public services become priorities for the national communities, and as well in which there are common senses brought to the management of the economy, in the sense that, for instance, taxation systems need to be proportional and rather than regressive. If you've got big fortunes and you make big fortunes out of the work and labor in your country, you'll be paying more taxes proportionally as well than those who are just living off a wage, for instance. It's really commonsensical in those terms and absolutely radical given the current state of affairs that we live in. So there is no, forget about finding their revolutionary Marxist political theory at the moment in the programs of Podemos, and forget about finding advocacy of total nationalization of means of production in the country. Not at all. There is as well an interest in recovering strategic sectors of economy for the public governance, but is really moderate in those senses of social democratic standards. This is a political translation of what, after all, the people around the so-called 15M movement, the Indignados, was claiming. That movement was, as you know, shapeless, rather lacking ideological orientation, but in its conclusions, just on the one hand, reclaimed regeneration of democratic governance. That is, that there should be a closer relation between politicians and those who were not professional politicians. That went through a reformulation of how political parties work. They cannot separate representatives from those who are on the streets. Podemos translated this structure to some extent to a model in which people would have a larger degree of intervention in public matters. But on the other hand, was what really some people could not understand, and is that in the Indignados meetings, if you attended them, you would start to hear, well, what we want is public education. We've got the maintenance of a strong public health system. We really want decent salaries. And then people would ask, but are you left-wing or are you right-wing? And we said, no, we are apolitical. And well, you need to translate that. I mean, and we need to understand that you cannot really just start to patronize people who do not know how to give labels to these feelings. Podemos said, well, what can we do at the moment? Really understand that these are left-leaning demands and that they are totally unsatisfied, but that we cannot necessarily or should not necessarily present them as class-based demands. Let's just bring common sense to these demands and just present them as what they are, really basic characteristics of a moderately secure welfare society. To some extent, this is what has been translated in the political and economic program of Podemos, in addition to other political claims having to do with setting boundaries to rampant public corruption, and really establishing dialogues with notions of national diversity within the country, recovering sovereignty as well at the core of it. So that's really a bit of the general description. This, and I think Pat was right to mention that in terms of how this appeals to youth, if you just look at basically surveys and basically the analysis of electoral behavior, people under 40 years of age, the majority of people under 40 years of age going to the ballot box support Podemos. For you to have an idea. That really changes totally when you just go above that rank of age and the Partido Popular becomes the majority party. But as well, Ciudadanos, which is a right-wing Podemos, receives a strong support among those below 40 years of age. There is a generational gap of people saying, we are not anymore willing to be governed by those who have brought us to this situation. You need to translate this as well, and how you do it, I think, will define who comes a victor. The second question, which is there possibility to stop as well the growth of extreme right-wing movements and I think xenophobic movements in Europe? Certainly I do believe so, because you just have to understand that the main force leading the discontent that in turn leads people to support these movements has been neoliberal governance, has been really the displacement of the needs of the popular majorities. If there were governments who boldly would recover the idea of attending to these sectors of the population, which in principle do not reclaim a revolution, do claim the return of certain minimum common sense to economic affairs. If left-leaning forces were to emerge boldly speaking to these majorities, of course, the threat of fascism could be stopped. Of course, yes. There is nothing predetermined. If there is not a bold movement from these forces, which would include the cooperation of, for instance, the Labour Party in the UK, there is a danger that there is further growth of right-wing fascist movements.
Geoffrey Balchi from the Politics and the Pub Organizing Committee. First question is, why isn't Europe seems to be looking for a model out of crisis? Now, what seems to be a shining star is the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque region. They seem to be more an exception than the rule. Why isn't their example gaining traction as a leader, political leadership? The second question is with regard to the peseta. Are there any moves to restore the peseta, even as a dual currency coexisting with the euro? What are the pros and cons behind it?
Regarding your first question, I think the models of cooperatives as part of a possibility of a larger range of reforms in economic production is feasible, but I wouldn't be very fond of adopting a cooperatives model as really just the one to be implanted in the whole of the country. You really do require a lot of experience and a lot of training to reach healthy cooperative system, and that requires time. So trying to expand that model across borders and towns and regions always brings the challenge of seeing what happens. Is a learning experience? Yes, but you need to attend to really the realities of different sectors of production. So in my view, finding experience in those models is important. You can try to as well see if they apply to the regions, but they shouldn't be a priority. I think the priority should be to recover government power and start to set boundaries to the piracy of neoliberal governance. Out of that, let's start to attend to really the necessity of transforming economic production and the world of labor. But yeah, in my view, like radical proposals of let's just generate a model for cooperatives as a legislatively compulsory model wouldn't be wise at all. And the second question, which has to do with the peseta, well, technically I couldn't tell you about the cohabitance of the two models. Politically, I would say that, of course, unless there was a shift in the governance of the European Union, some people may wonder what is to be done when you cannot really just control monetary policy. And for some countries, certainly to have control of monetary policy would make a big difference in terms of actually just strategically working for the reactivation of production. For instance, the feasibility for this in Spain, I see very limited at the moment. On the one hand, because of the costs that reverting to a previous currency or a new one would imply, but on the other hand, because you need to start with a very strong political base of support for it, and I don't think that you will have it. So you need to somehow negotiate the possibilities of political, economic maneuvering within the current scenario for the time being. In an ideal world, yeah, if it were a matter of going to sleep with the euro and waking up with a peseta, I think a progressive government in Spain would benefit from having control of monetary policies, devaluing or revaluing the currency according to productive needs. In the current state, very unlikely.
Thanks very much, Lewis. Jim McElroy is my name. Very informative talk. Thank you very much. I suppose to summarise the situation in Europe, really it's part of a worldwide populist revolt against neoliberalism, as you have explained, and you have a left-wing and a right-wing response. And essentially, to me, what is happening in Europe in all sorts of different strange ways in different countries is a polarisation between the left-wing response and the right-wing response. It's even expressed in Australia with Pauline Hanson on the one hand and other responses to the neoliberalism in attack in Australia. What I would like to ask is how do you see this happening? For example, in Britain, I think that what is happening with the Corbyn phenomenon and the Labor Party situation in Britain is that you have the possibility of a left-wing development there. And despite the attacks on Corbyn, he's actually, people have attacked him and said that he's going to hand over power to the Tories for the next 10 years and this sort of thing. But that's not actually what's happened. The Labor Party under Corbyn has won all the local government elections and is showing tremendous signs that they could actually challenge the Tories for power. So I think we have to be really careful about the idea that these left-wing responses can't challenge are not in a position to challenge the right-wing response. I think that a Corbyn-led Labor Party could actually change a lot in Britain and challenge the right-wing Tories and lead to that. So I think it's more complex in Spain and more complex in a lot of other areas of Europe. But essentially, I suppose my question is this polarisation between the left-wing response to neoliberalism and the right-wing response really challenges the left to unite and form some kind of very, very coherent response which can actually defeat these right-wing forces. Maybe you could comment on that. Thank you.
I certainly agree that you see a scenario of polarization, even just at the moment gaining a global scale, because you just have to look at the other side of the Atlantic as well, and the signs that there might be as well growing discontent with establishment politics in the US and the possibility of actually dividing up the two blocks of politics in the US differently. But let me say why I argued that the Corbyn movement, I'm not really at all, I think, underestimating its strength, but I'm saying that in the current situation and after Brexit and what is happening within the Labour Party is not boding well for what might happen to this left response to polarization in the UK. And that partly has to do with the lack of boldness in part of the responses of Corbyn rather than the excess of boldness and so on, or people actually claiming that he's become more conservative or anything of the like. I think it has to do with matters of politics of communication, but as well I think the worrying signs of Labour in the UK have to do with the fact that there is a tradition of good results in municipal elections, not translating on the one hand on the national level, but as well, there is as well the big problem with Scotland for the Labour Party. Region within which there wouldn't be the possibility of a strong left-leaning government in the UK. And if you just look at the results there, they are not very promising. So you've got a number of factors saying that there are at least certain challenges for that left-leaning response. It can be reconstituted, definitely. It needs to be reconstituted, absolutely. Unless something of the like happens, yeah, there is the prospect of a strong and long-lasting dominance of conservative politics. Having said that, just to touch on geopolitics, which I think relates to all these issues, I think a worrying as well prospect of the fragmentation in Europe has to do with how this will affect geopolitics at a global level. Because what might happen, of course, any separation of the UK from Europe is going to translate into a further leaning of UK foreign policy towards US foreign policy. US foreign policy, which is unlikely to recover any sanity in the near future, unless so if Trump, for instance, were to jump onto riding the missiles of the country. UK, if anything, is going to lean further towards that pole. But let us look at other potential poles of fragmentation, which may have to do with the eastern border of the European Union. If they fragment, they are going to become as well potential satellites for Russia, which wants to recover, maybe not some ground, but at least some corridors of security, and on the other hand, the United States, of course, jumping onto those territories through different means to try to intervene there. So that be the scenario as well that doesn't bode well for the idea of any notion of equilibrium and if you want moderation within the near future. What happened to other countries if they were to decide to just detach themselves from the European Union, for instance? That they will struggle to build, I think, supranational networks of significance to have a geopolitical voice. So, in my view, that's another reason why the European Union should be contested as a space of governance from left-leaning forces.
Actually, I want to just pick up the last point you made, and it seems an enormous area, really. As the topic tonight is to do with potential European fragmentation, political fragmentation, regional fragmentation. You've made it clear you can't predict how these things will go, but there are pressures there. There are pressures in that direction. You've indicated neoliberalism is a major part of this. I'm sure you're aware of Yanis Varoufakis' arguments about the architecture of Europe hasn't really been up to what the European project entailed. I wonder if you could just reflect on those institutional pressures within Europe itself, which go part way to explain these pressures towards fragmentation.
I think I could just put that simply. It's true that the lack of democratic governance within these institutions is extraordinary. And I think any progressive reform of this potential progressive reform of the European Union would require certainly a democratization of these processes of representation within the Union. Certainly the architecture at the moment is like when you just live in charge of building up your house. To someone who doesn't not want you to communicate with your sons or wife, maybe some people, or husband, some people will be very happy with that type of solution, but builds walls in between your bedrooms and let people in the kitchen to make the decision for those who are temporarily in the toilet, that type of thing. That is a little bit the architecture that at the moment exists there, and unless a more transparent and easily communicatable form of institutional architecture were to be built, difficult would be reproduced in the shorter term. There is a lack of democratic governance that should be addressed, but in my view, that can be reformed. I mean, if Europe has, the European Union has demonstrated something, is that in some cases for the wars, and most of the time for the wars, but there is the possibility of renegotiating conditions and creating frames for cohabitants. There is nothing naturally, essentially wrong in the European population that this cannot lead to something different. A new architecture is needed, yes. Can that be achieved? Probably as well without having to fracture the European Union.
Go back to an earlier question where I think Jim reflected about the significance of the Pauline Hanson vote here. And how does that resonate with some of the dynamics you see in either UK or in Europe as a whole?
Well, I think there are connections. First of all, with what we were briefly discussing previously, I think that people have rushed to condemn the voters of Pauline Hanson as really misguided racists and a little more. In my view, I'm not going to negate, of course, that the campaign of Pauline Hanson and other people in the last election here was terribly worrying in many respects, among others, the racist dimensions of it. But you have to understand that people supporting this type of political leader are not first and foremost and essentially racists, but as well people who have felt gradually and steadily that there is no one speaking to their needs, and they may be your neighbor, your cousin, your ex-girlfriend, your brother, or whoever. They are just normal people with normal needs and have been certainly unattended by the political directionality of affairs in this country. These people made a choice to support, in this case, an openly racist option, but as well an option that keeps on promising that they are going to care about them. Because let us remember that in addition to the racist commentary of Pauline Hanson, she has common traits with other movements in Europe, appealing to the working classes, and as well claiming that the land of this country should be for those who work it, and certainly for Australian owners, that workers in this country should not be ripped off by bankers, so on and so forth. So I think people with progressive politics should certainly denounce and criticize the racist aspects of this type of vote, but should understand that behind them there are citizens who are not neither essentially evil, not essentially always wrong in their choices. There is the possibility, of course, with communicating and the necessity of communicating with every citizen of this country and presenting alternatives. That is a problem in Australia, and that is probably in other parts of the world where, let's say, urbanites or elitist leftists have forgotten of people who live in the country or who do not know how to read classical philosophy. That's a big mistake, and certainly a mistake that is costing dearly to those who believe in progressive politics.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about Greece and the left-leaning government that won power there and has struggled to renegotiate loans from the monetary elites in the Union.
I just would say that certainly that exemplified on the one hand really the way in which current European governance has become a neoliberal club capable of really the worst forms of blackmail to bring people into the correct discipline, that is, into the discipline that is going to keep the current state of affairs. The complications are multiple, and as you know as well, generate a lot of divisiveness within left politics in the country. At some stage there was a strong mandate to basically say we should not really just surrender to this blackmail, and a majority of the Greek people supported that option. Eventually, and I'm not going to really just strongly judge as well the number of pressures that Syriza's government was experiencing, the government decision was different, and that has paid dearly as well consequences. We need to understand as well that in addition to what we consider to be the strengths of Syriza and the Greek people, the level of pressure in an isolated nation within the European Union, with no other governments really just potentially supporting them in the short term. And with the current architecture of the European institutional architecture of the European Union, as our colleague was rightly pointing out, were really difficult. I mean, the prospects and the decisions. So disappointing, certainly. I think perhaps there should have been more boldness in the government, and really should have been a mandate should have been followed to basically stop to the European Union. I do not want to judge the decision of Syriza in the sense of turning our backs towards it, because I think Syriza continues to be necessary for a potentially progressive European Union. Those forces that supported Syriza and continue to support it could be essential as well for a reformulation of European politics.
I think we'll wind it up with that answer. We've had a really, really rich discussion tonight. I think everyone really appreciates what Dr. Luis Angosto Ferrandes has done for us. So please thank him one more time.
Thank you.
I hope we hear more from him in future sessions here.